When dangerous jobs spring to mind, often things like soldiers, oil workers, firefighters, or police are the first things that come on your list. But one that usually follows this vocational hell is that of those who work digging underground. I mean, it's not surprising. The risk of deadly air, cave-ins, explosions, basically the list is endless of ways that you get injured or killed. On top of that, you've got the horror of being trapped. This would be the subject of today's video, an underground explosion followed by a trapping of which only one person would survive. Concerningly, the event happened fairly recently, 2006, and the cause is still a matter for speculation. Today we're looking at the Sago mine disaster. My name is John and welcome to Plainly Difficult. This video wouldn't have been possible if it wasn't for my YouTube, Patreon and Ko-fi members. If you want early access to the channel's videos, then you can from just £1 per month. And as always, links will be in the pinned comment below. Background. Unlike most disasters, our story's history doesn't actually go that far back before the actual disaster, which happened in 2006. Our history and background really only goes back as far as 2001. This would be the opening of the Sago mine in Upshur County, West Virginia, but at its opening it wasn't actually called the Sago mine, instead having the name Spruce No. 2. However, this would actually change a couple of years later in 2003 when the mine quickly changed owners, who then promptly renamed it to the aforementioned Sago mine. The new owners were Anchor West Virginia Mining Company, whose parent company, Anchor Group, were then taken over by International Coal Group Incorporated in 2005. But the ownership spider's web doesn't end there. Anchor West Virginia Mining Company was then renamed to Wolf Mining Company again in 2005. This pure nightmare of tracking company lineage is common, where the industry is constantly eating and digesting itself, much like the oil and shipping industries, where companies look to shed off assets to balance the books. So, the mine was laid out like this. Entrance via an underground box-type opening was made, going into 5 drifts, which had 2 working areas. Previous areas that had been worked were sealed off as newer sections were dug out. The mine is staffed with 145 employees, working 2 production sections over 2 shifts per day, and 1 maintenance shift Monday through Thursday, and 1 production shift and 1 maintenance shift Friday through Sunday. The working sections are located 2 miles from the surface. The transportation of workers and material is accomplished by battery-powered track man-trip vehicles. The coal is mined via remote-controlled continuous machines. From the machines, the coal is then transported to the surface via a conveyor belt system. Ventilation around the mine was provided by a fan placed at the number 5 drift. This pushed air into the mine and assisted with ventilating the humans and machinery within. The ventilation is vital for safety, as over 90,577 cubic feet of methane is released during operations in just a 124-hour period. The mine produced in 2005 492,000 tonnes of coal, over 285,000 man-hours. During this time, the mine sustained 14 lost time injuries, putting the site above average for the national number of injuries. But this would be just the tip of the deadly iceberg at the Sago mine. The disaster. It is the turn of the year 2006, and our story begins with the Sago mine reopening after a 2-day shutdown. The mine hardly dug up any coal since the evening of the 30th of December 2005. But for the staff, who had had the last couple of days off, the holiday was coming to an end, with the start of shift at 6 AM on the 2nd of January. However, before the machinery could be restarted, checks had to be done by management. This would take place in the early hours. The shutdown didn't mean that the site was completely unstaffed, as an unlucky small maintenance crew had worked over the previous days, checking and maintaining the machinery. The weather for the morning was very lively, with thunder rumbling and lightning flashing over the dark sky. Managers, including the safety director and maintenance chief, arrived on site around 5 AM. and gathered in a director's office to run over any issues and concerns for the shift ahead. Around 15 minutes later, workers began arriving in preparation for the start of their shift at 6 a.m. At 5:30, the superintendent arrived and joined the managers in the meeting. Around the same time, the conveyor belt system was restarted. At 6 a.m, the production crews set to work on the second left area of the coal mine, climbed aboard a battery-powered man-trip and went underground, followed by the first left crew. Nearly reaching their area around 6:25, approaching the track switch for the first left. In the meantime, up on the surface, the weather was rapidly deteriorating into a full-blown storm passing overhead. The thunder was getting louder as the lightning neared the mine site. Around this time, the mine dispatcher was on the phone to the mine superintendent, as the storm was over the mine around 6:30 in the morning. A flash of lightning struck near the mine, and at the same time, all of the carbon monoxide alarms started sounding. At around the same time, the first left crew, now at the track switch, were engulfed in dust and debris. A blast of air blew some of the workers' hats off who were travelling in the man trip. The first left foreman stood up at the same time, and the gust of air blew him out of the vehicle. The dispatcher instructed the first left crew to leave the mine via the intake escapeway. However, nothing had been heard back from the second left crew, the area that the gust of air and debris had originated from. 4 men from the surface, including the dispatcher, donned breathing equipment and planned to enter the mine to find the silent production crew. They reached roughly 9,000 feet or 2,700 metres into the mine before having to turn back due to high carbon monoxide levels. It soon became apparent that there were 13 missing personnel, still likely trapped near the second left section of the mine. Meanwhile, these missing men were still alive. After feeling the blast, they had tried to escape. They boarded their man trip and made their way back, but not too far down the track, the route was blocked by a collapsed structure. The crew attempted to walk out via another way, but this was also hindered by debris. The crew members put on their self-rescuers, but after a couple of the crew having faulty units, the foreman decided that they should go back to the working area and barricade themselves in to try and protect themselves from the smoke and dust. Back on the surface, the mining company called in for assistance from a specialised recovery team just after 8 a.m. in the morning, the best part of an hour and a half post the explosion. When the first rescue crew arrived at roughly 10:40 in the morning, shortly after the first MSHA personnel also arrived, rescue wasn't quick. Owing to the levels of methane within the mine, rescuers couldn't enter for another 12 hours. All while the trapped workers below were stuck in the toxic mine, some 11,000 to 13,000 feet from the mine's entrance. Testing of the air within the mine, made from boreholes on the surface, found that even after 12 hours, the air had 1,300 parts per million of carbon monoxide, more than 6 times the safe limit. But when emergency workers were finally allowed to enter, their working speed would be painfully slow, of only around 1,000 feet per hour. This was due to the severely hazardous conditions that the mine was in, with the risk of explosions and cave-ins very prevalent. The search would last for over 9 hours before rescue teams pulled out of the mine at 3:40 in the morning on the 3rd of January. This was the Tuesday. This was due to fears of explosion from borehole drilling. The rescue teams would return and re-enter the mine at 6 in the morning. More holes would be drilled around the roof where the trapped miners were thought to have been. Cameras and microphones were used to try and detect signs of life, but sadly nothing was found. On the 3rd day, one body was found, but that would just be the tip of the iceberg. On January the 4th, 41 hours after the explosion, 11 miners were found dead at the working face behind a makeshift barricade. The 13th, Randall L. McCloy Jr., was actually found alive, but only just. McCloy Jr. would later on recount his ordeal after recovering in hospital. It's a very harrowing read. The excerpts are in the MSHA investigation report. Basically, he saw all of his workmates slowly lose consciousness and go one by one. Finally, he would also succumb to the air, but as we know, luckily he was found. The cause of death was carbon monoxide poisoning. Even more tragically, some of the miners wrote final notes. These were passed on to family members. The disaster is pure nightmare fuel, and the loss of life was all too tragic. The mine would be shut down and closed for use officially in 2008. But what was the cause? Well, frustratingly, it would not result in a definitive answer, but there was an investigation nonetheless. The investigation. Investigators from the MSHA would be doing the investigating. This would be an 8-member independent team. In order for the investigation to begin, ventilation in the mine had to be restarted, as well as the underground power repaired, and examined to see if it was safe for people to enter. This recovery phase would prevent entry for a little while, but it did allow time to conduct interviews with those who survived the day's events. Once the mine was able to be explored once again, investigators went about searching for potential clues. The investigation would be rather controversial, requiring multiple separate investigations, including the company's internal one. But even after congressional hearings and a couple of years of no real answers, a few theories would be posed as to the cause of the explosion. The West Virginia Office of Miners' Health and Safety and Training report into the disaster would put the cause down to an excess of methane buildup from the shutdown ignited by lightning or sparking from electrical equipment. The explosion epicenter was determined to be in a newly sealed off section called the Old Second Left section. Now, this area was closed off on the 11th of December, just a couple of weeks before the blast. This is normal to seal off unused areas. At the mine, Omega blocks made from dense foam was used. There were 10 seals installed, and investigators found all 10 seals had been pulverised. It would later come out that these blocks couldn't resist the required 20 pounds per square inch of pressure required by the US Mine Safety and Health Administration. It was found that more resistant blocks would not have prevented ignition, but would have stopped the blast from entering live working areas. In the aftermath, the MSHA director announced a moratorium on the use of Omega blocks. This would make mines seek stronger concrete-based alternatives. But the actual spark that caused the methane explosion and the source of flammable gases still remains a point of speculation. The flammable gases could have come from a few places. As I mentioned earlier, the mine naturally releases methane as the coal is dug from the mine face. But there was another potential source. Near the sealed-off section, there were a couple of natural gas wells. It is thought that the flammable gases could have leaked and built up within the sealed-off area, subsequently being sparked off. But regardless of the cause, one thing is for sure. The safety equipment provided to the crew was inadequate, with multiple self-rescuers being faulty, forcing the crew to turn back to the main face. This most likely sealed their fate. The disaster was one of the USA's worst mine disasters up to that point, since the Farmington disaster in the 1960s. But the death toll would be overtaken rather quickly in 2010 with the Upper Branch mine disaster, which I've done a video about, which will be linked here. So that's my video on the Sago mine disaster. It's going to be a 3 on my scale. This is what I've got for my root cause analysis card. Do you agree? Let me know in the comments below. This is a Plain Default production. All videos on the channel are Creative Commons Attribution Share Alike licensed. Plain Default videos produced by me, John, in the currently very wet and windy corner of southern London, UK. And all that's left to say is thank you very much for watching, and Mr. Music, play us out please.